The ultimate betrayal: how a family's blind faith led to tragedy. Teenage years are often considered the most vulnerable and transformative period in a person's life, shaping identities and futures in profound ways. It is a time when individuals transition from the innocence of childhood to the complexities of adulthood. In these years, they carry with them a mixture of curiosity, hope, and insecurity. While their carefree smiles might mask inner struggles, many keep secrets, some out of fear, others out of embarrassment. Sadly, these unspoken burdens can sometimes lead to heartbreak and tragedy. The story of Justice Garrett serves as a haunting reminder of how silence can hide unimaginable suffering and lead to devastating consequences. In 2018, at just 16 years old, Justice's promising life was cut short in a manner so harrowing that it left an indelible scar on her family and the state of Florida. For her mother, Danielle, the tragedy was a brutal revelation, a realization that she had missed the signs of the nightmare her daughter was enduring. Justice Mary Garrett was born on March 19, 2002, in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. As the eldest of two daughters, she was often described as the light of her family, a bright, cheerful young girl with a natural ability to bring people together. Her younger sister, Jeanette, was 10 years her junior, and Justice embraced her role as a nurturing and protective older sibling, often guiding and caring for her with affection. Together, they were raised in a loving home by their parents, Danielle and Sebastian Garrett. However, like many families, theirs faced challenges. In 2016, when Justice was 14, her parents divorced. While the split was amicable, it marked the beginning of a series of changes that would ultimately alter Justice's life forever. Following the divorce, Danielle assumed custody of her daughters. Despite the emotional toll of the separation, Danielle worked tirelessly to provide a stable environment for her girls. However, everything shifted when she met a man named Robert Kern in 2017. Robert quickly became a significant figure in Danielle's life, and by the fall of that year, Danielle and her daughters moved to Sorrento, a tiny rural town with a population of just over 1,000 people, to live with him. For Danielle, it was a fresh start. For Justice, it was an uprooting that left her struggling to adapt. The move to Sorrento was particularly difficult for Justice. She had to leave behind her friends and the familiarity of New Smyrna Beach. Adjusting to a new school midway through the academic year added to her struggles, leaving her feeling disconnected and out of place among her peers. Justice also found it hard to accept her mother's new relationship. She didn't trust Robert, and the transition into his home deepened her discomfort. However, being a naturally kind and understanding person, Justice did her best to avoid conflict. She respected her mother's choices and focused on blending in at her new school. Despite these challenges, Justice's bright personality shone through. Known for her social, friendly, and humorous nature, she quickly made new friends. Among them was Rochelle, a classmate who became her closest confidant. The two were inseparable, and their bond offered Justice a sense of stability in her otherwise turbulent life. Rochelle's home became a second sanctuary for Justice, a place where she could escape and rediscover some semblance of normalcy. But as Justice tried to navigate her new life, she carried a growing burden that she couldn't share with anyone. On the surface, she appeared cheerful and composed, but subtle shifts in her behavior revealed a growing unease that she kept tightly guarded. Subtle changes in her behavior, like her sudden reluctance to return home or her nervous glances when her stepfather was around, hinted at a deeper issue. Unfortunately, these signs went unnoticed by those around her. Teenagers often keep secrets, believing they can handle their problems alone. For Justice, this silence proved fatal. Her tragic death in April 2018 shocked not only her family but also the entire state. Her story is not just about a life lost, but about the lessons it imparts, lessons on vigilance, communication, and the devastating consequences of misplaced trust. In telling Justice's story, we hope to honor her memory and shed light on the unseen struggles many young people face. Her life, though tragically short, carries a message: Never underestimate the importance of listening, observing, and fostering an environment where no one feels the need to suffer in silence. The morning of April 13, 2018, began like any other for Justice Garrett. It was a typical Friday, and Justice was preparing for school. However, a small delay set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Justice had overslept and missed the school bus, leaving her scrambling to get ready, a small but fateful delay that would alter the course of her life. With her mother, Danielle, preoccupied with looking after her younger sister, Jeanette, who was running a fever that morning, Justice decided she needed to find another way to get to school on her own. It was a decision that would change everything. Justice's stepfather, Robert Kern, offered to give her a ride. Though hesitant, Justice eventually accepted. Danielle later admitted that she had initially been unaware of this arrangement, as she had assumed Justice would take the public bus. It was only when Justice failed to return home that Danielle began piecing together the details of that fateful morning. Justice's last known interaction with her family was heartbreakingly brief. She packed her backpack, said goodbye to her mother, and left the house. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day at school. However, by the evening, Danielle began to sense something was amiss. Justice hadn't come home on time. Initially, Danielle assumed her daughter had gone to her friend Rochelle's house after school, something she frequently did. But when Justice's phone remained off and Rochelle called the next morning asking about her, Danielle's casual worrying turned into outright panic. At this point, Danielle realized Justice had never made it to Rochelle's house or even to school. A rush of dread overcame her as she hurried to file a missing person report at the local police station. The search for Justice began immediately, but finding answers proved to be more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Law enforcement initially treated the case as a possible runaway situation. Teenagers, they reasoned, often act impulsively. Perhaps Justice had decided to return to New Smyrna Beach to visit friends for the weekend without informing anyone. This assumption delayed the urgency of the investigation, despite Danielle's insistence that her daughter would never leave without letting her know. The first major step in the investigation was reconstructing Justice's movements on the day she disappeared. Interviews with friends and teachers revealed that Justice had not shown up for school that Friday. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras revealed an even more troubling detail. Justice had never approached the bus stop. This contradicted the initial assumption that she had planned to take public transportation. Instead, neighbors reported seeing Justice getting into a car identified as belonging to Robert Kern. When questioned, Robert admitted to driving Justice that morning but claimed she had asked him to take her to a neighboring town, Dand, to meet a secret boyfriend. According to Robert, Justice had begged him not to tell Danielle about this meeting. He said that he had reluctantly agreed, hoping to build rapport with his stepdaughter. However, this account quickly raised suspicions. Why had Robert not mentioned this earlier? And why did no one else in Justice's life know about this supposed boyfriend? Investigators began unraveling Robert's story, starting with surveillance footage from the route to Dand. None of the cameras captured Robert's car near the supposed destination. Instead, data from his phone revealed a detour to a remote wooded area outside of town. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation. Detectives now suspected foul play and began focusing their efforts on Robert. As the days passed, the small, quiet town of Sorrento buzzed with rumors and speculation. The disappearance of a bright, kind-hearted teenager like Justice shocked the community. Some locals spread baseless and often hurtful theories, suggesting Justice had run away, joined a religious sect, or been entangled in a secret relationship. Others claimed to have seen her in various locations, though none of these tips led anywhere. Amid this chaos, Danielle and Jeanette could only wait in agony, holding on to a faint hope that Justice would return home safe. For days after her disappearance, Danielle's fragile hope was irreparably shattered. A jogger running along a secluded trail on the outskirts of Dand reported finding a body in the woods. The discovery was grim, the remains of a young girl, heavily decomposed and disfigured, lay hidden among the brush. It was later confirmed through DNA testing that the body belonged to Justice Garrett. The investigation into Justice's death intensified as law enforcement worked to piece together the events leading to her tragic end. With Robert Kern emerging as the prime suspect, the stage was set for a deeper dive into his actions, motives, and the secrets he had been hiding. The small delays and missteps in the early stages of the search now loomed large as haunting reminders of how fragile the line between hope and despair can be. Fin 3. Kwak Hiotraben Hu. With Justice Garrett's remains tragically discovered, the investigation into her death became the highest priority for law enforcement in Sorrento, Florida. Detectives faced a daunting challenge, unraveling the sequence of events that led to her untimely death and identifying the perpetrator responsible. The small, close-knit town, shocked by the loss of a bright, kind-hearted teenager, became a hub of rumors, complicating the work of the police. Examining the crime scene, the discovery site in the wooded outskirts of Dan presented investigators with a grim scene. Justice's body was heavily decomposed and bore clear signs of foul play. Her clothing was torn, and portions of her remains showed evidence of damage caused by a corrosive chemical, later identified as chlorine bleach, which investigators suspected was used to obscure evidence. Forensic experts determined that the substance used was chlorine bleach, an agent likely chosen to destroy DNA evidence. Despite this attempt, fragments of soil and debris on her body hinted at possible locations tied to the crime. Investigators meticulously collected samples from the scene, including soil, vegetation, and remnants of Justice's clothing. They also noted tire tracks leading into the wooded area, though the impressions were too faint for immediate identification. Every detail, no matter how small, was logged as they worked to reconstruct the crime. Interviews and evidence gathering. The focus soon returned to Robert Kern, Justice's stepfather, who had been the last person to see her alive. During his initial interviews, Robert's account was riddled with inconsistencies. He claimed Justice had asked him to drive her to Dan to meet a secret boyfriend, but when pressed for details, his story faltered. Surveillance footage did not place his car along any route to Dan, further eroding his credibility. Robert's behavior during questioning also raised red flags. He appeared unusually calm and detached, even when presented with the discovery of Justice's body. His demeanor contrasted sharply with that of Danielle, who was visibly distraught and cooperative. Detectives began to suspect that Robert was withholding critical information, especially after his contradictory statements and the lack of evidence supporting his claims. To corroborate Robert's movements on April 13th, investigators obtained a warrant to analyze his phone records and vehicle GPS data. The results painted a damning picture. His phone's geolocation data placed him in the wooded area near Dan at the time Justice disappeared. Additionally, soil samples from his car's tires matched those found at the crime scene. This mounting evidence positioned Robert as the primary suspect in Justice's murder. Revelations about Robert Kern's past. As the investigation deepened, Robert's past came under scrutiny. Public records revealed a troubling history of criminal activity, including prior charges of burglary, substance possession, and domestic disputes, painting a concerning portrait of Robert's character. Though none of these charges were directly related to violent crimes, they painted a picture of a man with a pattern of poor judgment and reckless behavior. Danielle, devastated by these revelations, admitted she had been unaware of Robert's criminal history when she moved in with him. Friends and neighbors also came forward with unsettling observations. Several reported seeing Robert exhibit controlling and manipulative tendencies, especially toward Justice. One neighbor mentioned overhearing heated arguments between the two, often initiated by Robert's excessive strictness over trivial matters. These accounts added weight to the theory that Justice had been living in an increasingly hostile environment. The turning point. A significant breakthrough came when detectives uncovered Robert's online activity. Forensic analysis of his devices revealed searches related to incapacitating substances, methods to destroy DNA, and secluded locations near dams. This evidence suggested premeditation, indicating that Robert had been planning his actions for weeks, if not months. Further analysis revealed a fake social media profile that Robert had created to interact with Justice, posing as an anonymous admirer and fostering a disturbing pattern of manipulation. He had used this account to interact with Justice, posing as an anonymous admirer. Friends of Justice later confirmed that she had mentioned receiving unwanted messages from a persistent individual online, though she never suspected her stepfather was behind them. This revelation not only established a disturbing pattern of manipulation, but also provided a potential motive rooted in obsession, building the case. With mounting evidence tying Robert Kern to the crime, detectives moved forward with formally charging him with the murder of Justice Garrett, building a case grounded in digital footprints, forensic analysis, and witness testimonies. They presented their findings to the district attorney, who approved the charges. Robert was arrested and held without bail pending trial. Forensic evidence, digital records, and witness testimonies formed a compelling case against him. The tragedy of Justice's death and the shocking betrayal by someone she should have been able to trust sent shockwaves through Sorrento. As the town grappled with the loss, law enforcement vowed to ensure that Justice's story would not end in silence, but with accountability and truth. As the investigation into Justice Garrett's murder progressed, the spotlight increasingly turned to Robert Kern, a man whose outward appearance as a stepfather masked a deeply troubling psyche. Through meticulous examination of his actions, history, and behavior, investigators painted a chilling portrait of a man consumed by obsession and an unrelenting need for control. A man of contradictions, Robert Kern was, to the outside world, an unremarkable figure. At 43 years old, he worked sporadically as a carpenter and lived a modest life in the small, quiet town of Sorrento, Florida. He presented himself as a caring partner to Danielle and a dutiful stepfather to Justice and Jeanette. But behind this facade lay a man with a history of manipulation, poor impulse control, and a disturbing tendency to assert dominance over those around him. Friends and family described Robert as someone who alternated between affable and domineering, often shifting his demeanor based on the situation. In private, his controlling tendencies were more evident, particularly in his interactions with Justice. Witnesses recalled instances where he criticized her harshly for minor infractions, a behavior that escalated over time. The obsession. Robert's fixation on Justice grew in the months leading up to her disappearance. His fake social media profile disguised as a teenage boy was far more than an innocent attempt to boost her self-esteem, as he later claimed during questioning. Instead, investigators uncovered a more sinister purpose, using the profile to infiltrate her personal life, monitor her interactions, and subtly manipulate her emotions. Forensic experts retrieved messages sent from this account that revealed a pattern of manipulation. Robert, under the guise of an admirer, alternated between flattery and criticism in his messages, fostering a toxic dynamic intended to manipulate and destabilize Justice emotionally. This behavior, according to psychologists consulted during the investigation, reflected a deep-seated need for control and a disturbing inability to recognize boundaries. Psychological red flags. As detectives delved deeper into Robert's past, they unearthed a series of incidents that hinted at his underlying instability. He had a history of volatile relationships marked by jealousy and possessiveness. Former partners described him as a man who needed constant validation and often resorted to intimidation when he felt his authority was challenged. Robert's online search history painted an even darker picture. Online searches for incapacitating substances, techniques to destroy DNA, and secluded locations painted a sinister picture of deliberate and calculated intent. These searches, when combined with his attempts to disguise himself online, suggested premeditation and a willingness to exploit every available avenue to carry out his plans. The double life. One of the most disturbing aspects of Robert's behavior was his ability to compartmentalize his actions. While planning Justice's murder, he continued to present himself as a reliable figure in the household. He accompanied Danielle to social events, helped with chores around the house, and maintained a friendly demeanor with neighbors. This duality allowed him to avoid suspicion and facilitated his predatory behavior. Neighbors later shared that Robert frequently isolated Justice from social interactions, often justifying it by emphasizing her need to focus on schoolwork or family obligations. In hindsight, these moments were seen as calculated efforts to distance her from potential sources of support. Lack of remorse. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Robert Kern's psychological profile was his lack of remorse. During his interrogations, he exhibited a calm, almost indifferent demeanor, even when confronted with evidence of his crimes. Experts noted his ability to deflect blame, often portraying himself as the victim of circumstance rather than the architect of a heinous act. In court, Robert's defense team attempted to argue that his actions were unplanned and the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. However, the overwhelming evidence of premeditation from his online activity to the timeline of events rendered this argument unconvincing. Testimonies from psychologists highlighted his narcissistic tendencies and his inability to empathize with others, traits that further solidified his guilt in the eyes of the jury. A legacy of pain. For Danielle and Jeanette, the revelation of Robert's true nature was devastating. Danielle's guilt over not recognizing the signs of his behavior compounded her grief, while Jeanette struggled to reconcile the image of a stepfather she had trusted with the reality of his monstrous actions. Justice's story serves as a haunting reminder of how dangerous individuals can hide in plain sight, masking their true intentions until it is too late. While Robert Kern's conviction brought a sense of closure to the case, the scars left on Justice's family and community remain deep and enduring. By understanding the psychology of predators like Robert, society can take steps to recognize the warning signs and protect the vulnerable before tragedy strikes again. The trial of Robert Kern, accused of the premeditated murder of Justice Garrett, began with heavy media attention and the collective gaze of the Sorrento community fixed on the courtroom. It was not just a trial of facts, but also a battle of narratives, as the prosecution sought to expose the full extent of Robert's calculated actions, while the defense tried to shift the focus away from his intent. The prosecution's case. The prosecution laid out a meticulous timeline combining digital evidence, forensic findings, and witness testimonies. Central to their case was Robert's online activity, which painted a clear picture of premeditation. Searches for incapacitating substances, methods to destroy DNA, and maps of secluded areas were presented as evidence of his planning. The prosecution argued that these searches, coupled with Robert's creation of a fake social media profile, demonstrated not just intent but obsession. Forensic experts testified about the condition of Justice's remains, noting the corrosive chemical damage consistent with chlorine bleach. Soil samples taken from Robert's vehicle matched those at the crime scene, further tying him to the location. Investigators detailed how Robert's phone records placed him near the wooded area at the time of Justice's disappearance, undermining his initial claims of innocence. Witnesses provided compelling testimonies. Rochelle, Justice's closest friend, described the changes in Justice's demeanor in the months leading up to her death, particularly her fear of Robert. Neighbors recounted instances of Robert's controlling behavior and his efforts to isolate Justice from her support network. Danielle, Justice's mother, tearfully recounted the last morning she saw her daughter alive and her disbelief upon learning of Robert's involvement. The defense's argument. Robert's defense team faced an uphill battle. They argued that while his actions were suspicious, they did not prove premeditated murder. They portrayed Robert as a man with poor judgment who had made a series of bad decisions. The defense suggested that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof tying Robert to the actual act of killing Justice. In a bid to humanize him, they called on former acquaintances who described Robert as helpful and reliable, though flawed. They emphasized that no conclusive DNA evidence of Robert's was found on Justice's body, largely due to the corrosive chemicals. However, this argument failed to sway the jury in light of the overwhelming circumstantial evidence. The psychological evaluation. Psychologists presented by both sides offered contrasting insights. The prosecution's experts described Robert as narcissistic and manipulative, highlighting his inability to empathize and his pattern of exerting control over others. They painted a picture of a man who meticulously planned his actions to avoid detection and achieve his twisted desires. The defense's psychologist, in contrast, argued that Robert's actions were impulsive and reflective of underlying mental health struggles. They suggested he was overwhelmed by circumstances and lacked the capacity for long-term planning. However, under cross-examination, the defense's psychologist admitted that the extent of Robert's online searches and preparations suggested deliberate intent rather than impulsivity. Verdict and sentencing. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The evidence of premeditation, manipulation, and the lengths Robert went to cover his tracks were too compelling to ignore. The judge sentenced Robert Kern to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again pose a threat to society. In her victim impact statement, Danielle Garrett addressed the court with a mix of heartbreak and resilience. She spoke of her profound loss and the enduring pain her family faced, but vowed to honor Justice's memory by advocating for greater awareness of domestic abuse and the red flags of predatory behavior. Community reflection. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure to Sorrento, but it also left lingering questions about how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Community leaders emphasized the importance of education and vigilance, urging families to recognize warning signs and foster open communication. Justice's story, though tragic, became a catalyst for change. Schools and local organizations began initiatives aimed at protecting vulnerable individuals and promoting awareness of unhealthy relationships. While nothing could bring Justice back, her legacy inspired efforts to ensure that her fate would not be repeated. The courtroom may have delivered justice, but the true impact of Justice Garrett's story lies in its ability to spark reflection, action, and a renewed commitment to safeguarding the lives of those who cannot always protect themselves. Reflection and aftermath. The conviction of Robert Kern brought some measure of closure to the case, but for Justice Garrett's family, the loss was irreparable. Danielle Garrett and her younger daughter Jeanette struggled to rebuild their lives amidst the shadows of grief and regret. The revelation of Robert's duplicity and his heinous acts left a lasting scar on their trust and their sense of security. Danielle carried an immense weight of guilt, reflecting on moments she might have missed or signs she failed to recognize. Despite the profound pain, she resolved to channel her grief into meaningful advocacy, transforming her tragedy into a mission for change. A call to action. In the wake of Justice's story, her mother Danielle became an advocate for awareness of domestic violence and the subtle warning signs of abusive behavior. She worked with local organizations to promote education about online safety, particularly for teenagers. Her initiatives included speaking at schools, conducting workshops for parents, and collaborating with organizations to educate families about the dangers of abusive relationships and the importance of online safety. The community of Sorrento also took steps to ensure Justice's legacy lived on. Schools implemented programs aimed at teaching students how to recognize and report abusive or controlling behaviors. Local law enforcement increased outreach efforts to encourage reporting of suspicious activity, and social services expanded their resources to assist vulnerable families. A legacy of change. Justice Garrett's story, though a devastating loss, serves as a powerful call for change. It has inspired efforts toward vigilance, education, and community support, standing as a reminder that even in tragedy, there is the potential for transformation. As we close this chapter, let us remember Justice Garrett not only for the heartbreaking loss, but for the profound impact her story has had on those who hear it. Her voice, though silenced, echoes through the actions of those fighting to ensure no other family suffers the same fate. Closing message. If this story has moved you, consider sharing it to raise awareness and spark conversations within your own communities. Together, we can build a world where stories like Justice's are less likely to happen. Thank you for joining us at Truth in the Shadows, where we shed light on the darkest corners of humanity to inspire change and vigilance. Stay safe, stay aware, and stay with us as we continue to uncover the stories that matter most.